This is a bit surprising, to be honest. When Caroline first rang me, she said, oh, it'll be a small gathering in a little room and 100 people or so, and I thought, oh, well, that's fine. I'll just sort of talk off the cuff a bit, have a chat. But as the numbers got to 600 and then 800, I thought I'd better write something down. So I did. Now I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion, questions, statements, whatever you like, and in some ways that's probably the most important part of the night, and I'm looking forward to that a lot. I'm going to talk about the economics of coal. I'm going to talk about Donald Trump, Paris, Finkel, Terry McCrann. And I'm going to argue that it's time for both sides of this debate to give a bit. Now, as you know, I think I was invited to here tonight because of a piece I wrote for The Australian in February that was headlined The Great Coal Hoax, and I wrote that headline. I thought I was very proud of it. And that was prompted, that article was prompted by the Treasurer Scott Morrison's appearance in Parliament 4 days earlier, waving a lump of coal about and saying, "This is coal, don't be afraid." And I, like a lot of people, I think, was infuriated and dismayed by that stunt. And I made two main points in the article, and some of you have got it on your seat if you want to have a read of it, but not everybody. Anyway, the first point I made is that coal is only cheap if the cost of dealing with the carbon dioxide that is released by burning it is not taken into account. And the second point I made is that Australia's energy mess, or crisis, is entirely the Liberal Party's fault. Now, I'll talk more about the true cost of coal later, but let's just talk about my second point for a minute. It was the Liberal Party's decision on the 1st of December 2009 to remove Malcolm Turnbull as leader and replace him with Tony Abbott by one vote that sent this country up a dead-end street on energy. And don't forget that John Howard went to the 2007 election promising an emissions trading scheme to deal with climate change. And that coalition policy came out of the task group on emissions trading that was appointed by John Howard in December 2006 to look into the matter. And it was chaired by Peter Shergold, the head of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and there were a dozen heavyweights from industry and the public service on the group. It took 6 months, and they concluded, and I quote, "Climate change is a global challenge that requires a long-term solution in order to avoid environmental, social and economic dislocation." And that second quote, "Market-based approaches that deliver a price on carbon will achieve greenhouse gas abatement at least cost." So that was 2007. And then they recommended an emissions trading scheme. So John Howard said, "Righto, that's fine, we'll do that." And so did Kevin Rudd, and so did Malcolm Turnbull. And mind you, this was 10 years after the rest of the world had come to the same sort of conclusion. But you know, it's better late than never. And here we are 10 years later with a decade of inaction and failure behind us. The Hazelwood Power Station has died of old age, and there's nothing to replace it. And that's because there's been a capital strike from the business and investment world, because they have understood, since before the Shergold report, in fact, that action on climate change is inevitable, and what's more, they're on board with it, and they can't see any point in investing in a place where everyone's still fighting about it. So how did Australia get into this mess? Well, it was because, as I said, the Liberal Party decided at the end of 2009 to switch from agreeing that climate change was a problem that needed a price to be put on carbon, to denying that it was much of a problem at all and calling the proposed emission trading scheme a great big tax on everything. And it's since emerged, because Tony Abbott's Chief of Staff, Peter Credlin, has admitted it, that they knew that the ETS was not a carbon tax, but they decided to go with that scare campaign to defeat the Labor Party. So it was a cynical bid for power, which also almost worked in 2010 and eventually did work in 2013. They were then, and still are, supported and egged on, in fact, by certain powerful parts of the media. And one of them, Terry McCrann, had a big go at me on Saturday, but he's far from alone. So just on McCrann's go at me, his basic point is that wind and solar power are always more expensive than coal and gas and are only possible because of the large-scale generation certificates provided under the Renewable Energy Target, which are currently selling for $80 per certificate. He says they're free riders as opposed to what he calls real power generation from coal. So I've got a couple of responses to that. First, there are hidden costs in both fossil fuels and renewable electricity energy. The hidden cost in renewables is that they're subject to the weather and are therefore less reliable than coal and gas, which produces a steady flow of synchronous power. So to put a price on this, the Finkel report last Friday proposed something called the Generator Reliability Obligation, under which new generators would have to guarantee a minimum dispatchable generation, that is, reliable power. Now, I don't have a problem with that, as long as coal's hidden costs are also properly priced in by putting a price on the carbon, preferably through a market-based mechanism, as recommended by Shergold in 2007. I mean, there can't any longer be any argument about the fact that there is a massive cost. And what price do we put on the Great Barrier Reef? Second, I actually think the RET is probably coming to its use-by date. The cost of solar and wind has collapsed to the point where in many parts of the world it is the cheapest form of energy and doesn't need subsidising at all. Australia's construction costs are higher than most places, so we're not quite there yet, but not far off. And that's especially true when distributed generation, which is to say software to collect rooftop solar and household batteries, are brought into the equation. So in fact, the futures market in large-scale generation certificates indicates that the market expects a big decline in wholesale electricity prices over the next few years, even though no new coal-fired power stations will be built. So all the renewable generation at the high price of LGCs is now encouraging is expected by the market to bring down the price of electricity, not drive it up. In a market where the equilibrium price is set every half an hour based on demand and supply, new supply that's bid in at a zero marginal cost, which is what solar and wind are, cannot possibly result in higher prices. But look, wind and solar are held to account for their long-run marginal cost, and that's reflected in the value of the energy plus the RET certificates. And their short-run marginal cost, which is zero, is usually ignored. Coal and gas, on the other hand, are promoted based on their short-run marginal cost, but their long-run marginal cost doesn't get a lot of airtime. And so Bloomberg New Energy Finance put out a report in February that put what it called the levelised cost of energy from a theoretical brand new coal-fired power station in Australia, one of the new ones that's efficient, low emissions, bringing all the costs, long-run costs, including environmental ones, and they put it at $134 to $203 per megawatt hour. That compares to a new build wind at $61 to $118 per megawatt hour, solar at $78 to $140, and combined cycle gas at $74 to $90. And as for the cost of coal with carbon capture and storage added, which many people, including Alan Finkel, have said will be the only way new coal will be built, if we would abide by our national and international emissions reduction commitments, the Bloomberg New Energy Finance Group says it's hard to assess, but they come up with a levelised cost of energy around $352 per megawatt hour, or around 3 times the cost of wind or solar. Now, the RET is due to run for 3 years, and I'm in favour of replacing it with something else. I'd prefer a simple ETS, but Finkel's clean energy target will do, I reckon, as long as the cap is set low enough to meet a responsible emissions reduction target and not simply to even the playing field with coal, which could happen, and I'll explain that a bit later. And that brings me back to Scott Morrison's stunt, which is where this began, for me anyway. A lot of the reason we're having this argument is the proposition that Australia has all these vast coal reserves that we can export for $100 a tonne to burn for electricity somewhere else, or burn it ourselves to make cheap electricity to support manufacturing. And if we don't do that, we're crazy. It'll go to waste. By the way, I don't say everyone in the Morrison, Abbott, McCrann camp is cynical. I think some people genuinely believe that global warming is not happening. But the most common opposing view is that Australia is too small and insignificant to make any difference. It is a problem, but we can't make a difference, so we might as well continue to use the advantage of our cheap coal resources. And that's an attractive point of view. A lot of smart people hold it, and a lot of them are in the coalition party room tonight as we speak. It's basically Donald Trump's worldview, which is that the world is an endless struggle for advantage, not a community of nations trying to get along and make the best of things. That there's no such thing as a great moral challenge or any morality at all. There's only advantage and disadvantage. And Trump believes that life is a zero-sum game. If you're not winning, you're losing. And you're going to win so much, you'll get tired of winning. But I do find it very interesting that the world's conservative politicians and the businesses that they are supposed to be aligned with have been travelling in very different directions on this matter. At the start, conservative politicians were in favour of action on global warming, while business people were dead against it. The main force behind the formation of the original intergovernmental panel on climate change in 1992 was the United States under Ronald Reagan, and one of the most enthusiastic supporters was Margaret Thatcher. In fact, both Reagan and George H.W. Bush actively promoted measures to combat climate change, although in those days I think it was largely about the ozone layer, and in particular the Montreal Protocol on substances that delete the ozone layer. And the main ozone culprit, chlorofluorocarbon, or CFC, was totally banned after the Montreal Protocol was agreed in 1987. And I'm sure the fact that the major producers of that were Japanese and not American was just a coincidence. So it wasn't until the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992 that the focus of climate action turned fully to that other damaging gas emission, carbon dioxide, and the treaty that became known as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, which was established, along with the plan to meet every year for what would be called the Conference of Parties, or COP. COP1 was in Berlin in 1995. But as attention began shifting from the ozone layer to global warming, and therefore from polluters in Japan to those in the United States, the American oil industry started cranking up its lobbying machinery into gear and got into full crank before COP3 in Kyoto in 1997. And as a result, 6 months before that big meeting that produced the Kyoto Protocols, the US Senate unanimously passed a resolution called the Byrd-Hagel Resolution that the United States should not be a signatory to it. In 2001, 6 months before 9/11, President George W. Bush got on board with that and reversed the earlier position of his father and withdrew America entirely from the Kyoto Protocol's process. And this was probably partly because his opponent in the 2000 election, Al Gore, was such a big environmental activist, so he had to do the opposite of him. And it was also because of corporate lobbying led by Exxon. Now, a couple of things to note about Exxon, just a little diversion before I go on about Exxon. In 2015, an investigation by a publication called Inside Climate News uncovered that Exxon knew about the role of fossil fuels in anthropogenic climate change through its own research as early as 1977 and covered it up. It was much the same as the tobacco companies that knew about the health effects of smoking, but covered that up, and the asbestos producers that knew that their products caused cancer and death and covered that up. And second, an oil tanker named Exxon Valdez hit a reef in Prince William Sound in Alaska in March 1989, and that was the worst oil spill in history at the time. So, throughout the period that Exxon was lobbying against action on climate change, which bore such spectacular fruit for it in 2001 by Bush pulling out of Kyoto, Exxon knew there was global harm to which it was contributing, and it was also grinding it out in courts, fighting plaintiffs' lawsuits over the Exxon Valdez oil spill. But like most companies, except perhaps Australian coal miners, Exxon has now completely switched sides, or at least says it has. ExxonMobil's website now presents the company as virtually an environmental NGO, complete with pictures of trees and whales. And Malcolm Turnbull has switched sides too, the other way. His website contains a transcript of a doorstop from December last year in which he rules out an emissions intensity scheme, which is a weaker version of the emissions trading scheme that he was in favour of in 2009. And as it happens, the man who became CEO of ExxonMobil a little more than 10 years ago, who was responsible for the change in that company, was Rex Tillerson, the current United States Secretary of State. And he was appointed 4 months before Al Gore released his PowerPoint show, An Inconvenient Truth, in 2006. 3 years later, in 2009, at the same time as Malcolm Turnbull was being sacked as leader of the Liberal Party because of his support for emissions trading, Tillerson settled all of the Exxon Valdez lawsuits and famously said at the time that he thought a carbon tax was the best way to reflect the cost of carbon in all economic decision-making. And now Tillerson is part of the Trump administration, and he tried unsuccessfully to stop the president pulling out of the Paris Agreement that had been signed by his predecessor. So let's talk briefly about Trump and Paris. Paris was a fairly weak, non-binding agreement with a goal that's barely enough, and the only sanction on it is naming and shaming, which can be strong, but not necessarily. But at least it was a deal. It was the first genuinely global framework for 20 years to tackle a complicated problem. In fact, it was the first successful global pact about anything for a long time. Trump's withdrawal from it was largely symbolic because he'd already killed Obama's plan to meet America's obligation, called the Clean Power Plan, with an executive order dated March 28th. And he'd also cancelled the $2 billion in payments to the Green Climate Fund. But the reason the US withdrawal matters is that other countries that are struggling to meet their promises, such as Australia, might feel off the hook. And in the middle of all this lobs Finkel, another expert panel, this time 5 people, not 12, led by the chief scientist rather than the chief public servant. And what does it come up with? Well, 3 things. A softer version of emissions control than the Shergold panel did in 2007. Finkel calls it a clean energy target, as we know, rather than emissions trading. He also came up with the generator reliability obligation that I mentioned before, as a sop to the coalies, as I call them. And he's come up with a repeat of the demand management recommendation that was first proposed by something called the PERA review in 2002. And yes, that was another review of the electricity system that was largely ignored back then, 15 years ago. But the point of Finkel, it seems to me, was not to produce the perfect plan or even the best plan, but to come up with something that both sides of this stupid, destructive argument can live with, so that we can maybe turn the clock back to pre-December 2009, when there was agreement about what was needed and there was the prospect of stable, vaguely sensible government policy. The way that Alan Finkel put it on Q&A last night was that they've tried to move the discussion from a debate about renewables or coal to a discussion about carbon emissions, the outcome. I think he's right. It's probably the only way to go. We need to recognise that we have a hung parliament in Australia, and probably always will, for a long time at least. And that means all policy requires compromise. It can't any longer be winner takes all. Tony Abbott, who seems to be the chief coalie still, said on 2GB yesterday, there are 2 criteria that I think are essential when we judge the Finkel report. First, does its proposals take the pressure off power prices, because prices should be going down, not up? And second, does it allow coal to continue? The Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce, went even further, saying that Finkel needs to result in a new coal-fired power station. So he seems to be making a bid for Abbott's job as chief coalie. Note, by the way, that the prices have only gone up since Abbott and the coalition came to power in 2013, even though he promised that his so-called direct action policies would bring them down. So I don't think Tony Abbott or the coalition has any credibility to lecture anyone on that. Anyway, for Australia to have a sensible, stable energy policy that encourages investment and innovation, resulting in both lower electricity prices and lower carbon emissions, two things need to happen. First, the coalies on the right need to accept a policy that means new coal power stations are only possible but not probable. And those of us who are opposing coal in favour of renewable energy need also to accept the possibility of coal power stations rather than a policy that rules them out. And investors will decide anyway whether one gets built or what gets built or renewables. It'll be up to the market. It'll be up to investors and business people to decide what happens. And they will decide, trust me, they will decide in the negative. There will be no more coal power stations. And it will come down to the cap. And it's the thing that everyone in this room should now keep an eye on and watch. It's the cap that the government will set for Alan Finkel's clean energy target mechanism. Finkel didn't suggest a number. He left it to the government, which is how we know the report is an exercise in political compromise. The way the CET will work is that when retailers sell electricity that's been generated with emissions above the cap, they have to buy certificates from somebody selling electricity below the cap. Doesn't matter how it doesn't matter how it's generated, whether it's renewables or so-called clean coal. So it's basically a cap and trade emissions trading scheme, but don't call it that. Now, the rumour has been that the cap will be 0.6 tonnes of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour, which is roughly the carbon intensity of gas-fired electricity. And that would mean that coal would be penalised and renewable energy would be subsidised. It would also mean that the target that only applies to renewable energy would be replaced by a new one that encompasses gas, which is obviously a fossil fuel. But I've been told privately that it won't be 0.6. It'll probably be more like 0.9, possibly even more, which is what the pro-coal brigade want, so that so-called clean coal would get under it, what they call high efficiency, low emission coal, or HELE. It's probably true that in the real world none of this matters because investors are not interested in any kind of coal. But as we've learned over the past 10 years, politics does matter, and it's important that the Finkel Review does achieve a policy that gets through our Parliament. Not because some unrepresentative crazies in the crossbench of the Senate have passed it, but because the major parties have aligned. So if what I've been told is right and the cap subsidises coal, then the compromise is gone and all bets are off. And it may be time for the barricades. So I'll leave that with you. Thanks.
What should the investment community be doing to speed up the transition? And I guess both away from coal and away from fossil fuels generally.
Well, look, the investment community is already doing it. There's a tremendous amount of money now going into renewables, more than, it's almost like a wall of money. There's so much going on. But for that to continue and to, and to grow to the point where we actually get to 50% zero emissions in Australia, that needs to grow. There needs to be a stable government policy that everyone can rely upon. And what needs to happen is that everyone knows what the policy is going to be. And the only way for that to happen is for the both sides of politics, the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, to fundamentally agree. I mean, we've got it with Medicare. We've basically got it with the whole health system, NDIS. We're sort of getting there with Gonski and school funding. There's lots of parts of policy and government policy in Australia that is bipartisan. I mean, Medicare is completely bipartisan and has been forever. But we need to get to the point where that is the same.
What is the current government doing about allocating funds for future rehabilitation of these coal mines? Because so far, they all seem to get off scot-free. They sell off the company, buy a shell company, declare bankruptcy, and off they go.
I couldn't agree more. And I think this is the basis of saying that coal is the most expensive electricity fuel. It isn't just about the short-run marginal cost, it's the long-run marginal cost, which includes cleaning up the mines. And that's the basis on which those figures that I quoted from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, I can't remember the numbers now, but the clear result of the research is that coal is by far the most expensive fuel for electricity. But you're right, people are just sweeping that under the carpet and allowing the companies to get away with it, and the government is not doing anything about it. I think it's a disgrace.
I know Mr Modi says that he wants India to have a renewable energy supply. And Mr Adani says they want coal for India. What's your position on that?
I'd listen to Mr Modi any day. Look, India and China have tremendous challenges to fuel their economies. It's not easy. They are building coal mines, coal power stations, but they both have very ambitious renewable energy targets. And so, I don't know what the exact numbers are like, but as I say, I wouldn't believe a word that a coal miner says about the potential demand for coal. Of course not.
The issue is obviously very partisan. How much do you think that is to blame by the fact that the solutions haven't been sold well enough to people who'd lose their jobs as a result of the introduction of, say, a trading scheme?
There's nothing natural about opposition to emissions trading in the Conservative side of politics. They started off supporting it, and John Howard supported it. The Australian Conservative parties supported it to begin with. Malcolm Turnbull did. The whole thing is cynical, in my opinion, and it's to do with using what they feel to be political advantage, and it was, let's face it. Abbott murdered Julia Gillard over the carbon tax. Absolutely murdered her. It was terrible what he did, but it was successful, and it was all the more shocking because it was successful.
Paul Krugman recently wrote in the New York Times that he felt that the anti-action in the GOP was basically being driven by spite. I was wondering how you would feel about that argument in the Australian context, and if
the only reason I think that Trump ended up withdrawing from Paris and killing the Clean Power Plan was because Steve Bannon persuaded him to stick with his promises, and it was all about the promise, and the promise was opportunistic at the time. I think that the Conservative parties, both here and there, do have a germ of decency in them, although it's possibly not in evidence today in question time or in the party room tonight. So we'll have to see how it unfolds.
Do you have a view about the best way to go forwards from here? Is it to get the common ground agreed to build a bipartisan approach, which will be low level and clearly not enough, and then press to ratchet it up, or rail against the slowness of proposed bipartisan action and go for a change of government on a faster basis, which is unlikely to be bipartisan?
Railing has failed. We need a bipartisan. That's what I said in the talk. I think we need a bipartisan policy. I think Finkel has provided the way for that, which is to focus on the outcomes, the emissions, rather than how it's done. And as I said in the talk, I think that really both sides need to accept the possible. That is to say, the pro-coal sort of non-believers in climate change, if that's what they are really, they need to accept that a coal power station, continued coal use, is only possible, not probable, and then it won't happen, which we know. And the other side, our side perhaps, needs to accept that it isn't ruled out. that we don't expect, we don't demand some kind of policy that says there will be no more coal. We can't. I mean, it's not going to get through. We have a hung parliament in Australia. We need to have an agreement. We need to have a compromise. We can't do otherwise.
What's the probability of Adani getting the money to build their train line to the Abbott Point?
I don't know about you're talking about the $1 billion from the North Australian Infrastructure Fund. That seems to me to be 50-50. I don't really have a strong feel for that. It seems to be 50-50. I think the probability of Adani getting the money to build the mine is 0. I think, Australian Treasury has declared it to be unbankable, and I'd go with them. I think, of course, it's unbankable.
I'm just wondering if you have any comments to make about the amazing growth of solar, its pricing dropping, and how that would impact the trajectory of the changeover.
There's just so much going on. I mean, there's the tenders for batteries, big large-scale, grid-scale batteries in both South Australia and Victoria. A lot of companies are bidding to supply those batteries. This is where the excitement is. This is where the money's to be made, and everyone's really keen on it. I just think that coal is going to get knocked down in the rush.
As people increase and put their solar on the roofs, there will be people who are left behind. So how would that transition be managed, do you think?
So what we've had is Hazelwood, 1,000 megawatts, come out and not be replaced. Now that's a disaster. And the way it'll be replaced, and this is what Audrey Zibelman says, the way it'll be replaced is through distributed power. She talks about how Hazelwood would actually be replaced by thousands and thousands of rooftop solars. But the trouble is that, it's just, we're not in the position yet to do it because they have not been sufficiently energised, and investors have not really moved because of the paralysis of policy in this country. I hope I can leave you tonight with a sense of optimism about it. I think that, I know we look at Adani and read about the Adani coal mine stuff every day and feel terribly depressed about it, but actually there's a lot going on that should give us cause to be optimistic.
Thank you for your questions, and thank you very much, Alan, for your answers. I'll now hand back to Carolyn.
When we very first as a committee read the article that we left on half of your seats, we could not believe that there was a person like this, a journalist who could just write about coal as a great big hoax. And we burst out, we've got to have this man spread this message. There's got to be some other way that we can offer him a platform other than in the Australian. So thank you so much for being able to share some of those insights. We have him on tape. I don't know what we're going to do with it, but you might find all sorts of ways in which you can think about the messages and a few little asides there that we'll see in lights. I just wanted to give him a little present, which is what we do at Lighter Footprints. We like to give our speakers a bottle of wind wine. This is wine entirely made from energy from a wind farm.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Really love it.